Hi everyone. Lovely to have you all with us today. My name's Sally Mansfield and I'm the Australian permanent rep based here in Geneva. So in my day job I cover a wide range of issues from disarmament through to human rights and most of the UN agencies and NGOs and so on caught in between. But one of the reasons that this particular session really appealed to me was because of that sense that it was going to focus on something that I think is common to all of these, and that's the importance of data, and in particular of disaggregated data. I've been here now around about a year, but my job before that in Canberra was dealing with human resources. And it became very evident in that area too that unless we understood what the shape of the problem was that we were facing, what the scale of it was and what the purpose and what the intention of our policies were, it was very hard to know where to start. It was very hard to know whether we'd made any progress, and it was very hard to know whether indeed we were getting where we wanted to go. So, as I say, talking today very briefly before the panel who's got all the expertise about the importance of disaggregating data in the context of disasters is really important to me. So to Heba and all of the team here, I have to say it looks a little bit like an Australian barbecue at the moment, which is women on one side of the table and men on the other. But perhaps that's just the gender and the disaggregating lens that I tend to cast over everything these days. But what is very nice too is we've got a strong Pacific presence here today, and Geneva is so far away. Often the Pacific isn't as much the centre of focus as it should be. So absolutely delighted that we've got Fiji and Solomons here with us. So thank you again for inviting me. And from an Australian perspective, there's just no doubt that gender and disability in particular are two issues that are really important. I know most of the reasons for us talking about them in an Australian context here in this conference is from the point of view of our development program, but clearly it's really important for our domestic policies, whether that's health, education, housing, infrastructure. All of these things matter in any decision that you're making. Societies that protect human rights, societies that protect gender equality are much more likely to be vibrant, to be productive and to be stable. And sadly, there's a very, very strong correlation between countries that are getting a lot of those things right and a lot of those that are getting them wrong, and the indicators in terms of conflict, health disasters, and so on. So again, every step we go, we can see that these issues are really critical to a productive community. We're particularly committed in Australia to helping countries in the Indo-Pacific region implement the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And that framework, of course, as you would know, emphasises the importance of collecting disaggregated data so that we can better understand the needs of each community at risk. For Australia, we've got a priority in building national capacity for Indo-Pacific countries in the neighbourhood, in particular from the point of view of improving disaster resilience. And that includes very actively promoting the roles of women in disaster resilience and recovery, but it also includes advocating for people with disabilities to be included in the design and implementation of disaster risk reduction activities. It's very clear that when a disaster strikes, it's too late. You can do things to respond to that, but a response is so much more powerful if the elements are right from the beginning and if the needs of each part of the community have been cleverly thought through and provided for ahead of disaster striking. It's also clear that from the data that women and girls tend to be disproportionately affected by disasters, whether that is conflict or climate related. And they also have different levels of resilience and a different capacity to recover. The data that is getting is being brought together, and which is increasingly useful and increasingly reliable, is also essential in terms of assessing the extent to which development efforts reach and benefit people with disabilities. And I think you'll find that the discussion today will give you a sense of how and what more can be done to use disaggregated data, seeing more clearly how it supports inclusion and the criticality of that in terms of identifying the particular needs and capabilities of men, women, boys and girls before, during and after crises. So collecting that accurate data, particularly around disability, is really crucial if we're going to strengthen the evidence base for disability-based inclusion advocacy and raise the visibility of people with disabilities in the global development agenda. Without adequate data, we just don't know who's being marginalised or left behind. Without adequate data, we can't comprehensively include women or people with disabilities as advocates, as leaders, as partners or beneficiaries in our development and humanitarian efforts. So it's particularly relevant in the disaster resilience context, where in those times of crises, people with disabilities are very quickly those who are the most marginalised. People with disabilities face particular barriers in accessing life-saving relief and recovery information and support. So that data provides knowledge, that knowledge can save lives, and that knowledge can help reduce the impact and speed up the resilience and recovery afterwards. It provides that evidence base to inform risk-informed policy and planning to reduce it, but it also allows us to better learn the lessons from what's going on today. So in short, disaggregated data is an absolutely critical step for achieving our promise to leave no one behind. So I very much look forward to hearing the rest of our speakers go into more detail, and I encourage you all to make the most of the session and to ask as many questions as you can that will be relevant to your particular areas. So thanks again indeed, Heba, for having me, and I wish you all the best with your constructive discussions today. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mansfield, and thank you for your commitment to this agenda and also for Australia's ongoing and past support as a gender champion, but also as a key player in promoting gender responsiveness of disaster risk reduction and resilience efforts. So thank you for joining us. Welcome. It's my pleasure to be your moderator for this session. My name is Heba Casas, and I work for UN Women. I'm the Chief for UN Women's Humanitarian Action and Crisis Response Office, and it's a real pleasure for UN Women as well to be co-organizing this technical session on how can disaggregated data support inclusion together with UNFPA and UNICEF. So a very warm welcome. We have an impressive lineup of speakers who are coming from really far away from Geneva and bring with them a wealth of experience and reality check and the voices that we often do not have the pleasure of hearing in the forums here in Geneva. So they will really bring some in-depth expertise to shed light on this issue. They will be unpacking the opportunities and challenges around the collection and the use of this aggregated data, and the centrality of sex and age disaggregated data to effective recovery and risk-informed resilience building. In various sessions today, and I've had the pleasure to be on an earlier session, so it's take two for Dolores and me, because we were together in the previous session this morning looking at leveraging women's leadership and women with disabilities leadership in informing disaster risk reduction and inclusive recovery, but we were really having a very interesting discussion around the differentiated risk exposure and how crisis affects different segments of the population differently, whether we're talking about women, men, youth, boys, girls, people with disabilities, and how this differentiated level of exposure really affects the different people's ability to prepare to withstand and recover from the crisis, and how we see that in terms of mortality figures, in terms of loss of livelihoods, in terms of access to information and resources benefiting from recovery efforts, but even in terms of influencing decisions around plans and disaster response. So in this panel, we will be looking at the aspects that will help the policymakers and those who are responding to understand these differentiated needs and really to account for them in how recovery plans are formulated and how we are moving to more risk-informed and resilient recovery. So with that, I would like to move to our first speaker to unpack the challenges and opportunities around the disaggregation of of data along gender, age, diversity. And move to our first presenter, Dr. Sekar Koryakose, the head of the Kerala Disaster Management Authority, India. He brings a wealth of experience and involvement in this area as a practitioner. So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Shekhar. I come from the south of India with, well, our own experiences. I don't know how far of that is to be replicated elsewhere, but, well, what we have gone through and what we have done is something that I would like to present to you here. My presentation is titled Minding the Gaps. We started minding our gap long back, even before India became independent. You need to know the context of Kerala. Kerala is slightly different from the rest of the country, the big, large India. We have a population density of 859 people per square kilometer, and we have 14 administrative districts. We are looking at 33.38 million people with a geographical area of 38,000. So it's a narrow strip of land which is right in the Arabian Sea. The distance between the hills and the sea is roughly about 80 kilometers. This is called the development anomaly of India. Kerala is. We have the highest human development index in the country, which is 0.8, and the next is 0.4. So you can imagine the disparity. We have the best sex ratio in the country. We have the lowest population growth. We have the highest health index, and we have the highest literacy rate, and we also have the highest SDG index in the country. We are the first child-friendly state in the country, which is way back in the 1999. We have the first transgender policy. We did the first complete census of disabilities in 22 types. First state in India to launch a disaster preparedness training program for persons with disabilities, which we started in 2015, and you're going to see a video of that. Strongest local self-government-based governance and participatory decentralized planning. So we stand on a set of capacities. What are our vulnerabilities? We are exposed to a multiplicity of hazards. You would have all heard about Kerala floods. I sent out a flyer a few minutes before, so you get a context of what we went through in 2018. We are susceptible to landslides. We are susceptible to floods. We have lightning deaths, which runs to about 35 people per year. It used to be 70, and with a great lot of effort, we have brought it down to 35. We are exposed to droughts. We had 2 historic droughts, and this is in a state which is known for its 44 rivers and pristine greenery, and then having drought in Kerala is unbelievable for the rest of the country. What are the disaster management institutions in place? We have the State Disaster Management Authority, which is chaired by the Chief Minister. Honorable Chief Minister was here in the opening plenary yesterday. He's in town. We have the District Disaster Management Authorities. We started our whole disaster management business sometime in 2015, evolved further, and finally we have a state-of-the-art building, which is 21,000 square feet right in the middle of the capital city, which also houses the UN Recovery Office for the floods. We have such a host of institutions which are involved in this, actually 30 different departments, so you can imagine the Herculean task of coordinating all of them and taking up disaggregated data, let alone disaggregated data, into the planning and preparedness process. What happened in 2018? We were impacted by heavy rainfall. You would see the details there. 14 of the districts were affected. 1,260 of our 1,664 villages were affected. 687 square kilometer land was flooded. Over 5,000 landslides were reported. We had 450 casualties with 73 children, 279 men, and 98 women. Remember, we only had one disability, one person with disability who demised in this whole 48, in this whole stretch of land, which has 779,000, that is 779,000 people with disabilities. So it's just one, and you will know how we came to that. Kerala has a model disability inclusive disaster risk reduction program. It is identified as the first national model. It has found its way onto the national guidelines as the first model and the only working model funded by any state government in the country. We have had specifically trained NGOs who were kind of given expertise in targeted rescue of people with disabilities. 2.3% of the population are differently abled, and they are spread across all the districts divided into 22 different disabilities, and yet our death toll of persons with disability was 1. 8.66% of our households have, and that runs to about 7 million households, which 8.66% has people with disabilities. What did we do? It's here. I think the audio which is not coming out. I think there is a balance. Should I pause it?
Everyone, but persons with disabilities the most.
Shall I start?
In the eyes of the world, Kerala, the southernmost part of the Indian peninsula, has always been a green paradise and widely known as God's own country. Its verdant landscape, healthy climate, and a high human development index has always won global attention. It was over this green paradise that nature unleashed its fury in the form of floods and landslides in August 2018. The unprecedented flood took away precious human lives and wiped out hundreds of dwellings and critical infrastructure. Disasters affect everyone, but persons with disabilities the most.
വോട്ട് ഒരു 250 മീറ്റർ അപ്പുറത്ത് ആ റോഡിൻ്റെ അവിടെ വന്ന് വരുവെള്ളമായിരുന്നു ആ സമയത്ത് വെള്ളം വന്നുകൊണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ അവിടം വരെ എന്നെ എടുത്താണ് അവർ കൊണ്ടുപോയത്.
Inspired by the United Nations principle of Leave No One Behind, announced as part of its Sustainable Development Goals, Kerala State Disaster Management Authority initiated a novel project to ensure that no one is left behind in the ambit of disaster risk reduction. This project was fully supported and funded by the state government of Kerala. After a series of consultations with disaster managers and persons with disabilities, the project was officially launched in 2016. To aid in the process, a handbook on disability and disasters was published by Kerala State Disaster Management Authority. The authority also produced various training materials in Braille, sign language, and audio messages in DAISY format. The website of the authority has also been made accessible to the persons with disabilities. The early warning messages are now being provided in audio format as well. Through this project, the authority is training persons with disabilities on survival skills and first aid in all the 14 districts of the state. Around 3,000 persons with disabilities have attended such trainings. 6 brochures have been prepared in Braille to educate the visually impaired. These materials have vital information on precautionary measures to be taken during floods, lightning, drought, earthquake, fire, and sunstroke. All this information have been produced in sign language too. This initiative was recognized nationally, and the project has been identified as the national model in the National Disaster Management Guidelines on Disabilities and Disasters, prepared in the year 2018 by National Disaster Management Authority. The training handbook Materials and other information have been made available on the website of the Kerala State Disaster Management Authority and on social media platforms like YouTube and Facebook. Every disaster is a challenge as well as an opportunity. Through the floods, Kerala has learned the strength of community cooperation and volunteerism in responding to disasters. The project proved itself worthy during Kerala floods when an NGO in Ernakulam district conducted specialized rescue for people with special needs, acknowledging that they were motivated and equipped to carry out the specialized evacuation through the capacity building programs organized by the authority. They proudly say there was no casualty among persons with disabilities in their district. The untiring efforts of the government of Kerala have made Kerala confident of transforming itself into a safer and more inclusive state. Leave no one behind.
So that was about disability inclusive DRR. We had sufficient data, and hence we could proceed pretty well in advance as to incorporate it as a standard operating procedure in our warnings issued, which talks in the first that the priority of rescue would be pregnant women, children, women, persons with disabilities, and then men. So that's our priority of rescue, and that's what you saw. Now, empowering women, Kerala has what is called a resurgent loan, which, you know, in Kerala, the head of the family is not men. The head of the family, officially, for all governmental purposes, is the woman. Hence, when we decided that we will be providing a household-level resurgent loan, it was the women who were the beneficiary naturally, because we have what is called a women self-help group, officially, Kudumbashree, which has 40 million women in that group. So you can go to this website where you will find details of it. Each of these beneficiaries were given about 100,000 Indian rupees to resurge back their household. And till date, we have 144,000 people who have taken that loan. It amounts to INR 12.53 billion in currency. We were also using a huge lot of data during the time of rescue with an open source platform called KeralaRescue.in. Volunteerism, distress calls were being fed in, live streaming of this data was given to the rescuers. We had a proper application through which this data was being provided to the rescue operators, which included one of India's largest mobilization of armed forces and volunteers. We have a Build Back Better platform, which is called rebuildlsgdkerala.in, where there you can find all the houses plotted by people through a participatory initiative, which indicates which are the individual houses and what kind of damage each of these houses had. You can access it online. In order to build back better, we needed to know where the floods have come, how deep it has risen. We created an application for that, gave it out to public, and told them to map it. We have 13,000 points in the 687 square kilometer, which indicates floodwater height. We are rebuilding even through disaggregation in that sense. You see, individual property of the government that we need to rebuild is offered on an online portal where each individual can go and contribute to that particular property, to rebuild that property. So the data is captured with photographic evidence and details and thrown in public domain. We also have started on with a program. Actually, the UNICEF is leading that. It's called the Janagiya Pankalithavum Punarnirmanam, which is basically accountability to affected. It's a pilot initiative. This toolbox is still in the development stage in Kerala. We experimented with it, and we think that this is useful. We are going to continue with this and kind of expand the scope of it in the coming days. An interesting example of what the women told. You see, when through this platform, we came to know that about 7% of women had an increase in their income. Now you look back, where did that come from? The government had, through a massive initiative, triggered a cleaning program, and women were engaged in that. And I already told you, much of our workforce is women. Hence, a certain percentage of women actually got an increase in their labor. What are we trying to do? We did India's first complete PDNA. We have a 4-pillar PDNA that has been done. We are trying to build back greener and build back better. We are focusing on community-level disaster risk reduction now. We have 4 pillars through which we think that we will achieve that. And lessons on data. This is my last slide, and I just want to conclude with saying 3 things. One is gather basic data through participation. Leave basic data in open domain, because you never know who is going to use it how. Focus investments in achieving social development goals to achieve disaster risk reduction. Please don't go and invest all the money in DRR. Invest in social development capacities. You saw Kerala's resilience, and that's only because right from the beginning, our forefathers invested in education and health. These are the 2 sectors where they invested. And last but not the least, I also have to mention that in SDMA, I have 31 professionals working. 21 are women, and they do the night duty. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing this great example, which shed lights on the value of the involvement of institutions and the importance of political will to open channels of participation and community engagement, and how that can open opportunities for harnessing their energy and their contribution to understand better these specific needs and respond to them. With that, I would like to move to Ms. Dolores Devesi, the country director of Oxfam in Solomon Islands. She has been involved in this area of work for many years. And as a community development specialist and as gender responsive DRR expert in the Pacific, she has led Oxfam's emergency response work in Solomon Islands, in Fiji, in Samoa and Tonga over the past years. So I've had the pleasure of hearing her insights before, and I very much look forward to hearing how she's going to shed light also on the issue of sex and age disaggregated data. Dolores, just a few questions to you. Having been on the front line of disaster response and recovery efforts for many years in the Pacific and small island developing states, you have witnessed firsthand the differentiated impact disasters have on women, on girls, on boys, on people with disability. Why is it so critical for us to collect sex and age disaggregated data? Just the top points why it is a must for us if we're responding effectively. And also, if you could just shed light on the role of women organizations and women leaders in bringing those insights and informing recovery efforts. And finally, it's always an opportunity for us to hear your recommendations for the international community if we are to move effectively on the collection of sex and age disaggregated data. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I think with the first presentation, if you were to look at the spectrum of which countries have a lot of data, that would be my co-panelist here. For us in the Solomons in particular, we're on the other end of the spectrum, where not a lot of data, not a lot of information is readily available during peace times and post-disaster. I think I have also been in situations where there have also been a lot of, I would say, horror stories of assistance that have come and have been not appropriate for the context. And therefore, I think the importance of having disaggregated data in particularly is for us to, I think, also be aligned to the fact that we all know that women, children, people with disabilities, young people are often the most impacted or the most affected. And to ensure that their needs are met, we need to also have the figures, have the data on hand so we can get a really good analysis of what the needs are on the ground. In terms of two key points I wanted to share here, one is around the effectiveness and equity of our response and recovery efforts. Having data readily available, being clear on where the needs are, will also help speed up our assistance and our recovery efforts. I have been in situations where we've turned up to do assessments, asking who else is here in the village. Are there any people with disabilities? No. Are there any people with special needs? No. Are there any people with elderly? How many elderly do you have in the village? Not sure. And therefore, only throughout your work in the villages and the communities, then you come across people with disabilities who have not been visible, that they're considered as maybe less important in response efforts, and therefore helping communities to have pre-disaster information or community profiles prior to disaster happening will speed up the assistance that will reach them, but also will also speed up, I guess, in terms of the recovery efforts. The second point I wanted to share is about accountability and validation. As a humanitarian agency, which is Oxfam, we also have a responsibility to make sure that the needs of the people that we are targeting are also met. It's not a tick in the box for us. It's about ensuring that we are continuously asking the questions, have we reached the most marginalized? And without the data available, it's always quite challenging. From our country perspective as well, it's only during when something happens that we all scramble to find data. Our intervention recently and over the past few years has been targeting particularly women and young people, also people with disabilities who now take up leadership roles within the village disaster committees and have been able to put in place pre-disaster profiles of communities. So making sure that we understand ages, the sex, in terms of the gender dimensions, but also in terms of what their, I guess, their livelihoods, their income. So having a much comprehensive profile, so that when something happens, it's a lot easier for us to have access to that information. My recommendations would be to ensure that there is targeted, investments in targeted inclusive programming, ensuring that we also provide support to the sectoral committees that was raised in the first presentation in terms of if you're looking at education and health as some examples, but also around localization, ensuring that communities, women in particular, are able to pull that information together with support from us because they provide a much more comprehensive picture on the ground. If we're looking at livelihoods assessments, they know where the food gardens are, where the income's coming from, and what would be the most affected in terms of when disaster strikes. Therefore, the importance of inclusion right from the beginning, having them engaged, having them involved, and at the same time ensuring that the data is readily available. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for highlighting the importance of pre-crisis data and country profiles and community profiles. And often we start to scrabble around trying to find the information in the aftermath of a crisis, and repeatedly we talk about preparedness and prevention, and not in many occasions we actually start this case of really analyzing the differentiated exposure to risk prior to the crisis hitting a community. So thank you for reminding us of that, and thank you for reminding us that this is also a question of accountability and aid effectiveness of our responses. If we don't know how different segments of the population are affected, how can we claim to have responded to their needs? And also thank you for your call in targeted investment with programming and localization for women organizations. So with that, that's a perfect segue to get to you, Françoise, our next speaker. Françoise joins us from UNFPA. She's the senior advisor for data and emergencies. She's based here in Geneva. I've had the pleasure of meeting Françoise some years ago in Iraq, where she was serving. She has a long career in different countries and different crises. So she brings with her a wealth of experience in this area and in terms of humanitarian assistance. So Françoise, you've been working on data covering many different emergencies worldwide for a number of years, and you're a practitioner on the response side and on the prevention side. Can you please share with us some of the key challenges that you see from where you sit in terms of collecting disaggregated data in emergencies and how those challenges affect the effectiveness of recovery efforts, and what would be your key recommendations if we are to bridge this gap in data? The floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon. Actually, this session is going to focus, is actually about disaggregation and inclusion. I would like to argue that we have to really make sure that disaggregation includes and doesn't exclude if we don't pay some attention to certain methodological issues. I will not repeat what was already said, and I don't think that anybody here needs in this room to be convinced of the importance of disaggregation. So I will look at it from a different perspective. I will look at how, if we don't want to leave anyone behind, how do we make sure that everybody is counted and every issue is included in whatever we want to address, in whether it is risk mitigation or risk response. So just to answer your question, Hiba, first of all, I honestly don't think that data in emergency is actually the same as data in general. I mean, we need to be rigorous. And the problem in emergencies is that we have a problem being rigorous. So how do we deal with this? Do we just do it quickly, thinking that it's rigorous and then we have the wrong data, or do we just take whatever we can and thinking that, and that's where pre-positioning data before crisis is so important, because it's all linked, what comes before, what comes during, and what comes after. I will go over a few things because I don't think we have a lot of time, but perhaps in the discussion we can discuss more. So to be able to disaggregate, I would like, first of all, data must be collected. All indicators approved by the UN Economic and Social Council to track SDG implementation demand some disaggregation, of course. And everybody's happy that we have it specified. A social status, gender, age, and location. As you know, not every SDG is required to be the same, has the same requirements for disaggregation. However, currently it seems that neither developed nor developing countries are in a position to comprehensively capture progress in achieving the first three SDGs, 1, 2, 3. Research carried out by the International Institute for Sustainable Development indicates that countries need to improve data collection if they are to focus on the vulnerable. They have found out that only 13% of the countries, of the 32 that have given voluntary reports, only 13% provided some disaggregated data for more than 2 of the 3 analyzed. So it's really very little. And actually, I have my colleague here, Danielle, who also participated, Shensul from New York. We are both from the humanitarian office, and I'm sorry, I should have said it, it's a new office for UNFPA. We worked both on ICPD review, and we tried to look at information to disaggregate data on ICPD implementation in 192 countries. To be able to get indicators with disaggregation potential, it was so difficult, and we ended up with very few classical indicators, and everything else that was really more special, more human rights based was impossible to get because it was not just simply not there, and things have not changed very much since then. The other thing is, how do we include the hard to reach? So before we get disaggregation, if you think disaggregation is very important, we first have to get the persons who we want to get information on. The poorest and the most marginalized are difficult to include in surveys. Groups may be indigenous people, minorities, persons with disabilities, as you just said, migrants, the homeless who don't have a home, how do you get them? People living with the HIV who are sometimes put aside in certain situations, countries, and we cannot see them. LGBTQI, people, drug users, sex workers, sorry. So to facilitate the participation of population group at risk, it's important to note here that OHCHR proposes the human right-based approach to data, which are really useful. It's a small book which goes over something that we can do to increase access to those people who are not likely to respond when we go, and we really need to proactively find them. The third thing is the issue in stratification is the validity of our categories. Some categories are really difficult to reflect in a questionnaire. So if they're not correct, if they're not valid, how do we stratify them? One of them, which everybody knows here, which everybody uses, is urban-rural. I don't know. When we were trying, again, in big surveys to have rural-urban, it's very difficult. So when you are asking very simple categories like, are you urban, and is this an urban or rural, with the global changes, with everything that is, with people who are commuting, with people who are, going to places that are calmer, we don't even know what is the spectrum between rural and urban. So actually, according to the 2018 UN standards for data disaggregation, we still have no harmonized definition of the widely used concept of rural-urban. In the US, another example is in the US, where stratification, in the census they have racial categories. For example, Arabs are not caught because there is no categories for them, and because they are usually as other or as white Caucasian. So recently, the Policy Link in 2018 came up with recommendations to change the categories of race to capture more the multiracial mix in the U.S. in a more granular way to address what they said, to address their needs in a more specific way. So that's another issue that we will go back later. So the issue of the validity of the categories when we're doing a survey, how difficult it is to just have them reflect what we want them to reflect. So also the fear of giving the information. Some people do not want to say that they have certain they are in a certain situation, whether they're sex workers or are on drugs or have a certain disease or even disability that we don't see because they don't want to be excluded. The time requested to get certain categories that are really important if we don't want to leave anyone behind, beyond those things that we know, the sex and the age. The granular information is really difficult because we need probing, and probing needs a lot of training, and we need time. So how do we do this? And then there are those categories that are intrinsically difficult, like if we're doing like in Iraq when we were trying to get the migration status, or why did you leave your town? What are the reasons? You need more information. You cannot put it in 4 categories. So how do we do this? How do we get stratification that reflects what we need? The fourth part that is important is census. Census data is extremely important, and but it's not always available in low resource settings. Census data, when it is linked with accurate small area administrative boundaries, can provide spatially explicit evidence based on population. However, for example, the Ebola response in Africa was not possible and was not quick enough because it did not have this information. The census data is difficult to get in those settings, and in many places where we have it, the reliability of population and housing census data has been questioned due to the accuracy of projection required from long delays between enumeration and data release. We know a lot of places that don't release data for fears or for some countries, as you know, that these policies, they don't release data. I know 2 countries in the Arab world, in Syria, for example, they have data, we don't get anything to be able to program with it. The omission of or undercounting of certain marginalized information group that I talked about earlier, but here you could add nomadic populations that are super difficult to catch. Informal settlements that are very difficult also to include in census and surveys. Insecurity and conflict, limiting enumeration in certain regions. So, they're in wars and in places where you have a crisis, when you cannot go because of security, you cannot have information. During a crisis, or even after a crisis, it's extremely difficult and it really limits, and that's why we'll look maybe later at other indirect methods. And the political. Disaggregation, okay, confidentiality is a very important thing in small numbers. So when you have small numbers, it's very nice, everybody's happy, but it's very important to go by the standards of disaggregating small numbers, because the smaller the disaggregation, the easier it is to identify people in communities and small districts. I won't go, you probably understand what I'm saying, I don't want to go very in detail, but we can discuss later. So finally, last and not least, disaggregation for inclusion or exclusion. I would like to give 2 examples for census in France and the US. So the French Republican model of integration and citizenship has been criticized very much, and if you just Google it, because according to a law from 1872, it prohibits the French, the census from making official distinction between citizenship in terms of race and religious beliefs. So the French demography has been limited in terms of, it's not included, this does not stand for the polls, so you have sometimes information indirectly from polls, but the census prohibits it completely. And the comment is, France needs a new legal approach to its model of republican citizenship that would allow its minorities to feel much more integrated, respected, and protected by the legal system. That is France. We would be very happy with this comment, but then you go to the US, where a similar question in the US recently has caused the opposite conclusion. The Department of Justice initiated the request for inclusion of the citizenship question to the 2020 census, asking people whether they were American citizens, saying because of with the pretext that they would be protecting their voting rights, and especially the voting rights of African Americans. The conclusion to this was, I want to clear the journalists, I also quoted the journalist earlier. So that journalist was saying, a member of the president's cabinet oversaw a plan to reduce the political power of a specific ethnic group. So he lied to Congress about doing that. So we have 2 situations where we have a census, when we have categories, and one of them is for exclusion. So in America, apparently, it was used because they knew that in places where you have a lot of Latinos, they will not say that they are there, because sometimes, even if they are afraid that they would come and investigate them. So they would have an undercount in the census. Having the undercount, you would have less resources going to those places where you have the undercount. And since those are usually associated with democratic parties, you would indirectly exclude the Democratic district from getting more federal money. So I give this example because, as a conclusion, I would like to say that, okay, data is required, disaggregation is required, but disaggregation is not a panacea if we want to ensure inclusion. We want to make sure that we have to improve data capture, proactively reach out to those hard to reach. And so maybe besides the surveys, beside the census, we have to maybe reach out to specific people, to answer your question, in areas where we know we have, for example, disabled groups, disabled persons that have not, and we don't see them anywhere in our data. We just go reach out to them. We go to the human rights NGOs. We talk to the local government. We do more things that are more like legwork, and we reach out to them. We cannot really rely only on big data and survey data and census data to give us everything we need to know about those people we want to include. But we can talk more in the rest of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Françoise. And this was really a great and very rich discussion. But thank you for highlighting the technical challenges, the challenges around time, around cost, and around the difficulty of capturing the hardest to reach. But I found it absolutely fascinating, your argument around the disaggregation of inclusion and exclusion and the politics of data use. And I could just see us having a dedicated discussion around that to delve deeper from also the experiences of developing and developed countries. But I think I'm going to pick that with you in one of our social gatherings. So thank you very much for that. And with that, I would like to move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ms. Sarah Brown. She's the thematic lead for disaster risk reduction at Practical Action Consulting. And she's been leading the work around a research looking at the gender and age inequality of disaster risks, which has been commissioned by UNICEF and UN Women. And Sarah, it would be great to hear your perspectives from your long experience, but also from your concrete experience in this last month around the study on gender and age inequality of disaster risks. What are the emerging findings and some of the key recommendations of your study? And what would you recommend for us from the initial findings that you're coming across as modalities or strategies to bridge the gap on availability and use of sex and age disaggregated data? Over to you.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the role disaggregated data can play in supporting inclusion. I've spent the past couple of months undertaking a review of data on differential impacts with UNICEF and UN Women, examining what credible data exists and its implications for our practice in disaster preparedness, humanitarian response, reconstruction and risk reduction. We reviewed existing studies on differential impact with a detailed overview in our upcoming report. Whilst available data is very limited, there are numerous examples of differential impact. These examples are context and event specific, often driven by differential exposure and context-specific inequalities. Women and girls are not inherently or uniformly at higher risk in disasters, and instead we need to delve into the complexities and the inequalities in a given location, the differences within and between broad categories, i.e. an intersectional approach. At a global level, we looked at Desinventar and other disaster impact databases. Out of 85 countries in Desinventar, only 11 disaggregated by sex for mortality. And out of those 11, only 0.65% of disaster-related deaths were disaggregated. It is a minuscule proportion of deaths that are disaggregated. These tiny data samples, outflanked by huge data gaps, need to be borne in mind when reading any sweeping global or regional conclusions on differential impact. Next, we looked at 3 case studies considering earthquake in Nepal, flood, cyclone, and drought in Malawi, and hurricane in Dominica. In all 3 contexts, disaggregated disaster impact data was limited. Nepal had slightly more data, particularly disaggregated mortality and migration data. However, even where some disaggregated quantitative data was available, it was insufficient to meaningfully inform gender and age-informed action in order to reduce differential impacts. In some reports and studies, there was a semblance of disaggregated data, but at closer inspection, it was census data on the demographics of population in the affected area. In order to get a well-rounded insight into differential impact, we found it useful to combine 4 existing types of data. Firstly, any disaggregated quantitative disaster impact data. Secondly, census data on the demographics of an area, including perhaps number of people with disabilities, number of single women-headed households, number of children. Thirdly, any qualitative insights into impact from surveys or focus group discussions in the area, sometimes focused on specific groups, e.g. children. And fourthly, and this seemed an underused data source in studies on disaster impact, context-specific data on inequalities. The combination of these 4 data types enabled a broader understanding of the areas of differential impact. And the areas of differential impact varied from one country and event to the next, which is unsurprising perhaps, as differential impact is often driven by context-specific inequalities. Utilization of the 4 existing data sources gave broad insights into differential vulnerability at scale and between women and men, old and young. However, there were minority, vulnerable or marginalized groups who were not appearing in the data, who were only mentioned in passing perhaps, but without any detail or insights onto differential impact. The mainstream data also tended to focus on singular identities, children as a uniform group, for example, not capturing the ways in which women or children with multiple vulnerabilities or areas of marginalization are differentially impacted. To add nuance to the analysis and gain insights into the experience of those facing additional areas of marginalization, we undertook what we are calling missing voices interviews, following a methodology that we'd piloted once previously when looking at gender transformative early warning systems. In each country, through literature review and key informant interviews, we identified groups facing marginalization in a given context. For example, widows in Nepal, transgender women in Malawi, children with albinism in Malawi. More on the methodology is available in the upcoming report, but for us, the Missing Voices methodology enabled us to listen to the experiences of individuals who are not usually centered in policy and practice. Individuals who are often not mentioned in PDNAs or preparedness plans, or who are perhaps grouped together in a list of vulnerable groups but without specific information to inform targeted action. An approach that's centered on building trust and listening to marginalized and vulnerable groups. And listening gave us insights into the ways in which marginalized groups were differentially impacted, and also gave us understanding of what were the differential impacts that mattered most to those individuals who were most at risk of being left behind. A few themes emerged from the Missing Voices interviews. One was the way in which entrenched discrimination impacted vulnerability pre and post-disaster. For example, limited quotas on female emigration, pushing women towards illegal migration. For example, limited land ownership for widows, exacerbating challenges post-collapse of housing. For example, the lack of ID affecting the support, access to support for gender minorities or for adolescent girls. I'll speed up. Other themes which will be expanded on in the report include the ways in which multiple marginalizations escalate impact post-event, impact of gender-based violence, and particularly the way in which people with multiple areas of marginalization experience gender-based violence differently or have additional barriers to reporting or getting support after gender-based violence. And a theme that came up time and time again was data gaps and the way in which data gaps on minority groups perpetuate exclusion, where those groups are not counted, they're not considered, and they're not centered in future response. There are further context-specific findings of differential impacts in different sectors: healthcare, WASH, livelihoods, education, housing, etc. in the main report, but here I'll just focus on two takeaways that have wider relevance. One, gaps in the data at national level do not need to excuse inaction. At times, in various reports and preparedness plans, a lack of disaggregated quantitative data seemingly excused inaction, with efforts to reduce gender and age inequality in disaster risk postponed until a future of improved data sets. Our conclusion is that in any case, disaggregated quantitative data alone is insufficient to inform practice, and in the absence of this future of excellent quantitative data, collation and analysis of other data types, namely census data, qualitative data, and context-specific inequality data, can provide an understanding of areas of likely differential impact. And gaining an understanding of differential impact is the key first step to adapting policy and practice to reduce those inequalities. And secondly, gaps within the data set at a micro level reinforce exclusion. Data gaps excluding marginalised groups were apparent in all data sets, including at census level, meaning marginalised groups were invisible in analysis, policy and practice. This issue was raised time and time again in our Missing Voices interviews, the way in which exclusion from the data set reinforces and perpetuates exclusion in action. Proactive efforts are needed to identify, build trust, engage with and listen to the experiences of those most at risk of being left behind. And one approach that we propose to doing that is our Missing Voices approach. The combination of these existing data types, including data on inequalities, with the addition of perspectives from those whose voices are less often centred in policy and programming, can help us to make a shift from a gender and age inequality unaware approach to one where we can effectively act to reduce differential impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing your initial findings, and we look forward to seeing the full research report coming out soon. And with this, I would like to move to our final panel speaker, Mr. Simeone Bula, who is the Australian Humanitarian Partnership Regional Coordinator. He comes with a wealth of experience and as a practitioner, as an advocate for the past 13 years on a number of social issues, but he has worked also in Fiji, in Vanuatu, in PNG, and Tonga, in promoting the inclusion of and the collection of data on persons with disabilities. So he comes with a practitioner and a reality check perspective as well. Simeone, from your experience in the Pacific, can you tell us about the centrality of the collection and use of sex and age disaggregated data in the response in the Pacific? And what are some of the best practices that you have come across in collecting disability disaggregated data? And what can we learn from your initiatives and engagement? It would also be interesting to hear from you, with your wealth of experience in working with people with disabilities, about their contribution to recovery efforts. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, Bulabnak, everyone. Very briefly, just a background on disability inclusion in the region. We're thankful that the representative of the Australian government is here. It's been one of the very key partners for us in the region in terms of advancing the inclusion of persons with disabilities. And also in terms of the impacts. In the past 3 years, we've had a lot of different hazards happening in the region. We've had an earthquake, volcano evacuation, 2 Category 5 cyclones, and this happens within 3 years in a very small region where people are separated with water. So it's really a challenge first to identify people and collect data on people due to the geographical location that we have. We're pretty much spread out in the ocean. And for me, this morning I would like to highlight the criticalness of collecting data on disability. We're thankful with the presentations of the panelists this morning. I feel like that I'll be just summarizing their presentations. They've taken up most of the points that I have on my presentations. And we've seen a few of the best practice with the government taking lead in the collection of data, with the state, with our representative from the Indian government. And it's really critical to ensure that persons with disabilities are pre-identified before any of these events happen. That is really, really critical. One, as we've seen, that it really saves lives when you know where they are. And also, it really ensures the effectiveness of mobilizing resources, human resources, technical resources, and even financial and other responses to ensure that persons with disabilities are taken to a safe location, or their lives are saved, even their livelihoods. Most of the times we focus on saving the person, but we really do not focus on trying to build resilience in terms of their livelihoods, which really helps them in terms of recovering and building back better after an event. And also, it really triggers the collection of this disaggregated data. It triggers necessary action that needs to be taken. And this will also depend on the people who are collecting the data and how it is used. In most instances, it's non-government organizations, disabled persons organizations who are collecting data on disability, which in most cases is just feed into the program work that they do. But we need this data to feed into changes in legislations, changes in policies, and also changes in processes within the system to ensure that persons with disabilities are not just part of a project for a short-term period to inform that, and they are part of the long-term sustainable action that state parties or duty bearers need to take to ensure their inclusion is not just a tick in the box, but it is something that needs to be done. A few of the key challenges of persons with disabilities in disaster. One of the major challenges for us from small island states in the Pacific is the absence of accessibility, even during peacetime. And it's really hard for persons with disabilities to identify where do they really need to evacuate to during disasters. And these are really critical data that needs to be collected prior to any event. This needs to be mapped in terms of where are the accessible evacuation centers, where are the accessible services, which services do they need to be referred to if things happened during an event. And the absence of this data, the absence of this information, it really plays a very critical role in the exclusion of persons with disabilities. So the ensuring that these data are available, it ensures that they know where to go, and also they know who do they talk to, and which services are available in order for them to be part of the action, and also to be part of the response action that different stakeholders are taking when these events are happening. Secondly is the different barriers that persons with disabilities faces during peacetime and also during disasters. One of the major barriers that they face is around attitudinal barriers, the stigma that's associated with persons with disabilities. And this really impacted how data are collected, and also in terms of the different tools that you might use in collecting data on persons with disabilities. As our friend mentioned about the issues with Latin Americans in the US, they tend to not identify themselves because of the different stigmas that's associated with them within the system. And that is something similar to persons with disabilities. Most of them don't identify themselves as persons with disabilities due to the perspective of people towards persons with disabilities. And when you're collecting data, these persons with disability, they tend to miss out on the different response mechanisms because they are not identified, they are not part of the mainstream data collection, they are not part of the disability data collection. So it's also critical the tools that you use when you're collecting disability data. And also around the environmental barriers, this is really, really critical for persons with disabilities, the lack of accessibility in terms of mobilizing themselves during events like this, during disasters. Movement of persons with disabilities is really, really, really critical. During one of the cyclones in the Pacific, we collected data around 960 plus people. And out of these 960 plus people, only 45 of them were able to get into an evacuation centers. It's not because there is no evacuation centers, but it's because it's not accessible to them. And they were not able to travel from their homes to the evacuation centers, and also due to the first barriers that I've highlighted around the stigma, the behavior, and also the discrimination that's associated with persons with disabilities. Also in terms of the communication barriers, in most instances, most persons with disabilities do not really access the different response mechanisms because they cannot communicate with responders, or they cannot communicate with people who are taking lead in the different sectors. So this also important that there's a point that I highlighted in the first barrier for persons with disabilities is the absence of reasonable accommodation. This is really critical for persons with disabilities. To ensure that these are available when you are conducting the different response mechanisms, and also even during preparedness time. This is really critical for it to be there to ensure, if we are to ensure the inclusion of persons with disabilities, reasonable accommodation needs to be there. And also around institutional barriers, this is really, really critical. I'll go back to the, when we are collecting data, it also depends on how do you define disability at your national, legislative, and policy level. Because this will determine on, when you're collecting data on persons with disabilities, it will determine on who are the people that you'll be collecting data about. It'll go back to what do you have in your national mechanisms. So it is really critical when you are defining the term disability or persons with disabilities in your national legislation's policies, it has to be in compliance with the CRPD. That is really critical. The contribution of persons with disabilities make to disaster recovery and resilience building. One of the biggest contributions that they can make is their lived experiences. They've lived through this as an affected person, and also as someone who might have already helped within their communities, within their various organizations. So this is really critical. In the work that we've done around collecting data on persons with disabilities, most of our enumerators are persons with disabilities themselves. So it's really critical, the working along with representative organizations of persons with disabilities. It plays a key role in representing persons with disabilities at the coordination level and also at the decision-making, throughout the decision-making process. In most instances, we bring in persons with disabilities when we are conducting needs assessment. But prior to that, when we are developing our procedures, when we're developing our different mechanisms around our emergency operating centers, persons with disabilities are not part of that. But then when you bring them in at the middle of it, it's really, really difficult to change things around again. So it's really important that they are part of the process from the beginning till the end. And also, persons with disabilities and their representative organization, they can facilitate linkages between persons with disabilities with humanitarian services and humanitarian actors with persons with disabilities, and provide necessary recommendations on how response can be strengthened to ensure that no one is left behind. And very critical, using their lived experiences, they can build capacity of humanitarian actors on how to ensure disability inclusion. The best practice on collection of disability disaggregated data and what we can learn from them, the tools that we use, for us, we recommend that use the Washington Group of Questions as a minimum standard for collecting data on disability. For the presentation that we have from they might have different tools, but as a minimum standard, use the Washington Group of Questions to collect data on disability. Persons with disabilities, trained as enumerators to collect data on persons with disabilities. This is really critical, and do not limit the collection of disability data to needs assessment, but also expand this to monitor and evaluate the accountability of actors and duty bearers in ensuring inclusion for persons with disabilities, and how national processes trickle down to the community and how community feedbacks affected into national process. This is really critical. And don't just count the number of persons with disabilities, but also identify the barriers, look at the risks and the vulnerabilities of persons with disabilities and their capacity to respond to different hazards and what needs to be done to ensure the effective and meaningful participation. And also very important, the nothing about us without us notion. If persons with disabilities are not part of it, it's not about persons with disabilities. So if you are to ensure that it's about persons with disabilities, they have to be part of it. They have to be at the table. And very critical, interagency and cross-sectoral collaborations. This is very, very important. The work that we did, we were thankful that UN Women, we worked with UN Women, UNICEF, UNDRR, and UN OCHA to facilitate the coordination around the collection of data for persons with disabilities. And through that, we were able to work together with the different clusters on how we can use the information that was collected on persons with disabilities to trigger the different actions that they develop, which the learnings from that particular event, and developed actions to take them forward, ensuring disability inclusion in these different sectors. And also really, really important for donor agencies. This is one of the best practices that we've seen from the Pacific. Having indicators on disability when you are pouring in money to respond to these different events. This is very important, because if you don't have these indicators, those who are implementing this response in the different sectors, it'll be just another day in the office. If these indicators are in that different funding mechanisms, persons with disabilities will definitely be part of that, because they need to report back to those indicators. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very rich presentation and all the very concrete recommendations and suggestions that you've made. We are running a little bit behind time, so we were originally planning to show a short movie that UNICEF and UN Women have worked on, but we will drop that because we've had the opportunity to show it earlier today, in favor of opening the floor for any feedback or questions from the floor to our panelists. Please.
Yeah, I'm Lars. I'm working for UNICEF in India, and I think we need to send a strong message from this small panel here to the main room, no? Because, I mean, it was taken up indeed. I mean, we have good examples from some states in India and other countries where indeed, but what you revealed is actually, I mean, very worrying news that, I mean, we all noticed in Sendai this disaggregation, disability and age disaggregation, sex and age disintegration, disaggregation didn't make it, it's optional. So that's a failure to me. However, we see, I mean, I think there's agreement here in the room that we have to have it if we want to do appropriate cutting-edge DRM, I mean, in all the phases. I mean, we just heard it. I mean, of course, many states are doing it. They pre-identify where are the vulnerable groups, where are pregnant women, and then action is taken and whatever, or people living with disability whatsoever, children. But let's raise this higher up. I think that we have to bring it to the main room. I don't know, if someone maybe still has a speaking slot or at the end of it, raise it higher. There is still room, I think. I mean, just in the Asia-Pacific presentation this morning, there were some stats given how many countries have now basically reported on Sendai Monitor. I think also quite some engagement by Australia. You're hosting the next regional platform, where indeed focus was also mentioned this morning by your colleague on youth and disability integration. So these are the topics, I mean, at stake, because indeed, if we don't get also the evidence on the impact actually of the disasters, then it's a lost case. Then we will be also, I mean, always running behind. So I think we can still get a dent here.
Great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Deepak Malik, and I'm representing HelpAge International. So thank you for few of you who mentioned age also as one of the inclusion issues. And many a times what I heard from the floor was that as if gender and disability are the main inclusion issues, which surprised me. And then there was a presentation which also highlighted so many different groups. which need to be included, and how data collection is important. And especially for Kerala, because their older people are too many, yes? And yeah, so just wanted to make a voice for older people inclusion as well. There is very less evidence. There is very less evidence that older people are also excluded. There, for example, in Katrina, it was over 60% older people who casualties. Even in Japan, more than 60% of the older people casualties were there out of the total. And interestingly, not much data has been there to even say whether older people were included in the emergencies after humanitarian crisis or not. So, and I think as this session stands, this is the first point. This is the first step which we can do always to recognize the vulnerability of any vulnerable groups by recognizing them in data. Yes. So we actually had done a study how older people are excluded when they are not included in data. It is on the HelpAge website, agingasia.org. So I request all of you to have a look at that. I have a copy of the summary of that report. Anybody interested can take a copy of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You will all have the chance to react. If there are any other comments from the floor. Daniel?
Thanks. Just a moment of reflection. I think those of us who deal on the quantitative side are always frustrated by global policymakers putting everything in the basket of disaggregation, which I think was very much what Francois was getting to. And I think that there's on the one hand leave no one behind, and on the other hand the disaggregation data. And to me, this panel is very much about how that actually works in practice. And the idea that it's not necessarily an accident that people are being left behind. Sometimes it's very, very deliberate measures to leave people behind. I think Francois gave very good examples of this, but others as well. And so I think somehow bringing the communities together who are for the empowerment of marginalized and vulnerable groups, and those who are producing and analyzing the data, and not just the actual counts, but as it says right here on this slide here, the drivers and consequences. And these communities, brush against each other sometimes, but maybe this here is an opportunity to bring them together more forcefully. Thanks.
Great. Anthony?
Yes, thank you. I'm Anthony Spalding. I work with UNICEF. Thanks to the great panelists. Just one quick question. I work very much I work in New York with UNICEF, but I look very much at the link between humanitarian development. And one of my continual sort of observations and frustrations is that we have a lot of data on vulnerability and on risk, but how do we get that into the hands of the humanitarian responders? How, when we support the government of Mozambique in the response to the two cyclones, how can we ensure that there's at least a minimum level of data in the hands of those first responders or the humanitarian response team? So M1, their response is informed by that, and B2, they're beginning to think about those issues as they look at how they respond and how they then recover. And I heard a good reference from our colleague in Kerala on how that was done, but it would be good to have any other reflections on bridging that gap. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So the final comment, and then back to, sorry, we're running out of time.
Thank you very much. Mine is a very quick one. I just want to point out the fact that it looks like Africa has been left behind from this data discussion, and we have a huge challenge there. And I'm Christy George again, from a gender advisor with African Risk Capacity. So we just did a regional consultation in the context of elaborating the gender strategy, and gender disaggregated data with age and disabilities was one of the major challenges, and we are still struggling on how to go around it. So we'll be very happy if there's a concerted effort or a network or whatever that is going to come out of this discussion. We'll be very happy to be part of it, to at least lift up be at least contributed solution in the context of the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will move back to our panelists and just please in 1 minute. I know it's very challenging, but 1 minute, and at the 1 minute I apologize, but I will be giving you a sign that you need to stop. And I'll start with Francoise. Okay, not you. I'll start with you because you were very keen. To start.
All right. To start with the question that you asked regarding age, yes, we have disaggregated data on age, and ages, we are very sensitive to age. Come June, we are starting with a geriatric care inclusive DRR program, which is funded by us, and we are paying 50 lakhs on that, like we did with the disability. And these projects are, remember, continuously funded by us. The project on DRR is continuing as mainstream project, and so will this geriatric care inclusive DRR program be. So that's a reaction to that, and to refer to Anthony's question as to how to bridge the gap. Our Chief Minister yesterday mentioned that very clearly. There has to be a concentrated effort on early warning systems, which is also disability inclusive and sensitive to disabilities or sensitive to this kind of disaggregated issues that we face. That early warning system will double up also as an information sharing portal. And that's what we did. We had our apps, we had our open source, we had our network of communication devices pre-positioned, and that basically enabled. Thank you.
Just a quick one regarding information that we collect. I think for me, any information that we collect or we want to use has to sit with the people on the ground because we want them to also be frontline responders. We want them to be seen not from the victim's perspective, but that they have a key role ensuring that we have the right data, that we have the correct information, and that they also own the information that's been collected. There's been, I think from my experience, a lot of agencies who have come in, collected data, but have not gone back to share the information with the communities. And again, I want to just re-emphasize the word localization and ensuring that it starts from the bottoms up.
Great. Thank you very much. Simeone?
For me, my last comment would be just in support with what our colleague here said around taking this forward to the bigger group. There's a need to ensure disaggregation even with the Sendai monitor. If it's not there, definitely it won't be counted. So follow on with that. There won't be any action. So it's really critical if this is part of that, and we take the commitment that are done by the state parties on the Sendai framework for them to monitor the implementation and then report back on the various indicators that they have committed themselves to. And the second to that is around the key to accessibility of data in terms of data sharing. This is really important. Sometimes it's for us in most of our context, it's really hard to get data out of the government or the various stakeholders. So I think it's really critical to share this information so that actors have this information when they're responding.
I'll just touch on two of the questions quickly. In terms of the question on elderly inclusion, in the Missing Voices interviews that we did in Nepal, Dominica and Malawi, issues of vulnerability of elderly people came up in all three, particularly elderly widows in Nepal, particularly issues around elderly people in Dominica in shelters having a huge amount of caring responsibilities whilst in shelters, and also having additional barriers to reconstruction, and particularly the impact on elderly persons when social support systems had collapsed and when there was emigration of middle-aged people in the country. And similarly in Malawi, the additional vulnerabilities of elderly people who are also carers for multiple grandchildren. Can I just really quickly on the getting data to responders, I think there's also the opportunity of getting data into standard operating procedures that are linked to early warning systems and into common alert protocols and into the kind of forecast-based financing approach coming from the preparedness side as well.
I won't add to anything, of course, but it seems to me that the issue that you mentioned about the context-specific vulnerabilities is very important to work on, because it can also bridge the gap to what we think we can share during an emergency. Sometimes it's very difficult to get information during an emergency, but you can get the information on the context. And if we have good research beforehand, linking context to certain things, we can maybe have them as proxies during emergencies. And I think that would be, we should be working on that, and we should absolutely make it mandatory to have certain things like sex and gender in everything. Unfortunately, and as you may probably know, the SAGR guidelines, and even them, they're like, the editors are not even enforcing those rules, even when they have signed those the commitment to including them. And I think that unless there is something high level, and unless we work really very much on getting certain indicators that are really good and the context specific beforehand, during emergency we cannot do better.
Great. Thank you very much.
With this, I would like to thank our panelists for a very rich discussion and for sharing with us very concrete recommendations, and also unpacking the key challenges, the key barriers, whether technical or practical, for the collection of sex and age disaggregated data and for its use and informing its ability to inform policy. I think we've heard a strong call for greater investment and targeted action in this area, but also for concerted effort in opening avenues for participation of those whose voices are missing or those who are excluded or the hardest to reach. So we thank you all for being with us, and we thank our panelists. And with this, I would like us to give them a round of applause for their contributions.